The humanitarian situation in Gaza is deteriorating by the hour. That's the word coming in from the World Health Organization.
An air and ground assault has displaced hundreds of thousands and reduced much of northern Gaza to rubble. Israel's bombardment has driven 80% of Gaza's 2.3 million residents from their homes. The crowded southern areas are now sheltering triple their usual population. A senior commander for the Israeli army said forces were now fighting in the heart of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza.
Palestinians are now flocking to the city's main hospital, Al-Nasser. They're seeking safety from Israeli strikes. International aid organizations are calling for a sustained ceasefire, warning that civilians are running out of places to flee to. And for more on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we're joined by Michael Lynk, Professor Emeritus at Western University and former United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. Professor, you've been following and working on this region for many, many years. Is this the worst you've ever seen it?
Absolutely. In terms of the death toll, this far exceeds previous wars on Gaza by Israel in 2008-09, 2014, 2018. There hasn't been a death toll like this among Palestinians since you have to go back all the way to 1948 to find figures that are even comparable to this. And in terms of the region, we haven't seen civilian death tolls with respect to a war involving Israel since Lebanon in the summer of 1982. And it appears that the death toll of Palestinians in Gaza is now going to exceed what happened in Lebanon in 1982.
Professor, the UN says Palestinians are now concentrated in less than a third of the Gaza Strip. Israel's army urging residents to head to designated safe zones to escape the fighting. Are people really going to be safe there? Where else can they go?
Well, taking what UN humanitarian officials are saying, there is no safe zone in Gaza. The place where Israel is trying to direct Palestinian civilians fleeing the war to is largely beach area with absolutely no facilities to be able to handle hundreds of thousands or even more than 1 million Palestinian refugees. There's no place to be able to feed them, to give them water, to provide sanitation, to provide even any sort of shelter now that we're approaching the Mediterranean winter. The terms used by UN officials are apocalyptic and catastrophic that I've seen in the last day to describe what is happening in southern Gaza. Keep in mind, we now have approximately 18,000 Palestinians per square kilometer in Gaza. We have almost 2 million people concentrated in the far south in the midst of heavy fighting, with obviously the Israeli army coming south and most of the Hamas battalions still in place and ready to fight them.
Now, Israel also says troops are inside Jabalia in the north, which was the biggest refugee camp in Gaza. They've also carried out military operations at hospitals. They claim Hamas hides and operates in such places.
They're saying that by and large, most of the hospitals are conflict-free zones. We've had reports from the United Nations that over 200 people have died from shelling or missiles hitting people who are sheltering in the hospitals. Most of the hospitals in Gaza are now absolutely non-operational. Their staff have been forced to leave by Israeli troops moving south in Gaza. There are no supplies, there are no anesthetics, there are no drugs. There's very little ability for these hospitals to operate. The only ones that are partially operating now and which received some humanitarian care in terms of medical equipment are those in the far south in Khan Yunis and in Rafah. Virtually everywhere else, it's a medical landscape.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has been telling families of hostages there's no possibility to bring everyone home right now. Hamas saying there'll be no further negotiations until the aggression in Gaza stops. What hope is left for those detained on both sides?
With respect to the Israeli hostages, there's approximately 138, I think the last figure that I saw, that are still being held by Hamas, according to Israeli military figures. I fear for their safety. They're obviously, I assume, being kept in the far south by either Hamas or by other Palestinian armed groups. But as this fighting becomes more and more intense in the south, there's always a danger that these bombardments are going to be hitting where the Israeli hostages are being kept. With respect to Palestinian detainees, we have to keep in mind that for all the Palestinian detainees that were released during the pause in fighting last week in exchange for some of the Israeli hostages, more Palestinians have been arrested over the last 7 weeks than have been released by Israel. So there still remains this extraordinary imbalance between who Israel's holding and who Hamas is holding. But I want to remind everybody that on both sides there probably is violations of international law. It is absolutely forbidden. It's a war crime to capture civilians and to hold them as hostages. It's also a violation of international law to be arresting mostly what have been young children under the age of 18 for fairly minor offenses.
And while we stay on the topic of international law, what is the US's obligation to rein in or hold Israel to account for its humanitarian record in Gaza? We've seen the US issue visa restrictions for those involved in violence in the West Bank, but it could do more, couldn't it?
Issuing visa restrictions with respect to violent Israeli settlers is below the lowest common denominator that one would expect. The Israeli settlements are a flagrant violation under international law. So says the UN Security Council for a resolution that the United States allowed to pass in December 2016 at the end of the Obama regime. They're deemed to be actually a war crime under the Rome Statute of 1998. So the issue or the threat to Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are not the violent settlers, though they are a threat. The main threat are the settlements themselves. They eat up Palestinian land. They wind up creating a disconnected Bantustan in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and they, given their strategic locations, they wind up denying the ability of Palestinian right to self-determination and the ability to have a contiguous, genuine Palestinian state. So, if the United States is going to take action with respect to settlers, it would be against the settlements themselves and those who build them and maintain them, not simply the handful of violent settlers who are causing such misery in the West Bank.
You've been observing the region for decades, and apartheid is a term that you've used to describe Israel's policies. Others, though, have an issue with that. They say Palestinians in Israel have many rights, including being able to serve in the Knesset. How would you respond?
Sure. My report, the last report that I issued as special rapporteur in March of 2022, looked at apartheid with respect to the occupied Palestinian territory, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And there I found overwhelming evidence using the measurement of international law, the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, to say this was apartheid. It's hard to find another word in English that would describe two separate peoples living under the same geographic and political unit, where rights are so unevenly distributed based on ethnicity and nationality, where Israeli settlers, the 700,000 or more living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, enjoy full civil, political, economic rights as Israeli civilians with very high standards of living, with the Palestinians living next to them, unable to vote, unable to be able to defend their property, and unable to have any measure of a path to a political horizon with respect to that. I'm not alone in talking about apartheid. This certainly is a consensus probably by the international as well as the regional human rights community. Israeli, Palestinian, and international human rights organizations such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have all come to the conclusion that it's apartheid either in the occupied Palestinian territory, in the West Bank, or in all of the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. For those who have argued that it's apartheid in Israel itself, they point to the fact that, yes, while Palestinian citizens of Israel have the right to vote, the right to serve in the Knesset, they're very much excluded from a number of pieces of legislation. Most importantly, they have very limited access to property and to land in Israel. There's no such thing as a Palestinian university, despite the high population of Palestinian citizens. There's a number of reasons why these human rights organizations came to that conclusion. It was meant not as a slur or as a slogan. It was meant as a genuine consideration of application of facts to international law.
Professor, really appreciate your expertise. Thank you for sharing with us today. Michael Lynk, Professor Emeritus at Western University and former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory.